In the bustling city of Dallas, Charlotte Davis, a determined head of internal affairs, takes on a battle far larger than herself. After a tense encounter during a routine traffic stop reveals deep-seated prejudice within the system she serves, Charlotte is compelled to act. But fighting for change in a divided police department isn't easy. Skepticism from her colleagues, resistance from senior officers, and the weight of systemic bias test her resolve at every turn. Amid the challenges, Charlotte dares to build something new, a mentorship program aimed at fostering trust and understanding between officers and the community. Along the way, she encounters unexpected allies, like a troubled teenager whose artistic talent becomes a symbol of hope, and a hardened officer who begins to reckon with his own past. Through moments of connection, acts of courage, and the steady power of kindness, Charlotte's vision starts to take root. But can one woman's determination overcome the entrenched walls of resistance? Will her efforts inspire the change she envisions? Or will the weight of opposition prove too much to bear? Charlotte Davis navigated her sleek black sedan through the streets of Dallas, Texas, the city's familiar skyline bathed in the warm hues of sunset. Her workday as the head of internal affairs for the Dallas Police Department had stretched long and tense, leaving her eager to retreat to the comfort of her two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. She had a routine: shed the tailored suit, kick off the polished heels, and sink into her plush gray couch with a cup of chamomile tea. That evening, she envisioned doing just that, letting jazz from her vinyl collection soothe her nerves. Her apartment reflected her personality, organized but inviting. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with titles on leadership, history, and criminal justice. The decor was simple but thoughtful, with framed photographs of her late parents and siblings adorning the mantel. Each photo carried a memory, a fragment of her journey that had brought her to this point. As Charlotte reached a busy intersection, the traffic light shifted from yellow to red. She came to a smooth stop and exhaled deeply, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the challenges she faced at work. Her role demanded grace under pressure. She was a woman of color navigating a predominantly white institution, which meant walking a fine line, being firm but not combative, empathetic but not emotional. The sharp wail of a siren interrupted her thoughts, and flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Charlotte's stomach clenched. A police cruiser signaled her to pull over. Confused, she obliged, steering her car to the side of the road. She rolled down her window as an imposing figure approached her vehicle, a tall, broad officer with an unyielding expression. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. "Of course, officer," Charlotte replied calmly, reaching for her glove compartment. She handed over her documents, her fingers steady despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. The officer, whose name tag read Carter, scanned her paperwork with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on her. "In a hurry to get somewhere?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "No, officer," Charlotte answered evenly. "I stopped when the light turned red." Carter's lips curled into a smirk. "People like you often think the rules do not apply to them." The words struck her like a cold slap. Charlotte knew exactly what he meant, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression neutral. "Is there something specific you are accusing me of?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The interaction dragged on, with Carter's questions veering into territory that had nothing to do with a traffic violation. Charlotte recognized the situation for what it was, a power play rooted in prejudice, but she also knew she could not escalate the encounter. Finally, Carter handed back her license and registration with a dismissive grunt. "You can go," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Charlotte drove off, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The encounter left her shaken, but also resolute. She had faced similar situations before, but this time she was determined to do something about it. When she pulled into her apartment complex, Charlotte spotted her neighbor, Mr. Henry, sitting on his porch. A retired postal worker in his 70s, Mr. Henry was a warm presence in the neighborhood, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. His porch light cast a soft glow, illuminating the neat rows of flowers he tended with care. "You look troubled, Charlotte," he said, his voice gentle but perceptive. She hesitated, then joined him on the porch. "I had an unsettling run-in with a police officer," she admitted. Mr. Henry nodded thoughtfully, his wise eyes reflecting a lifetime of experience. "It is not the first time you have faced something like this, is it?" "No," Charlotte said, her voice tinged with frustration. "And it will not be the last. But this time, I want to act. I want to address the root of the problem." Mr. Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You have always been a fighter, Charlotte. But remember this: change does not come from anger alone. It comes from patience, perseverance, and the kindness that catches people off guard." His words lingered in her mind long after she returned to her apartment. That night, as she sipped her tea and stared out the window at the city lights, Charlotte resolved to confront the prejudice within her department, not with confrontation, but with a strategy rooted in empathy and action. The sun crept over the Dallas skyline, casting a pale golden glow over the city. Charlotte Davis sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She had not slept much after the incident with Officer Carter. Her mind churned with questions and plans, grappling with how to address the deeply ingrained prejudice she had encountered. Her apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The journal Mr. Henry had given her the night before sat on the table. Its worn leather cover hinted at the history within, stories of resilience and unexpected kindness. Charlotte opened it and began reading a passage about a young man who had faced discrimination as a busboy in the 1960s. The story detailed how a kind stranger, a customer who noticed the boy's struggle, stood up for him, offering not just protection, but hope. The words resonated deeply, reminding Charlotte of her father. As a civil rights lawyer, he had always emphasized that change was most impactful when it started at a personal level. "You must make them see," he used to say. "You must show them what they cannot deny." Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a notification from the department's internal record system, a reminder about her weekly review. She hesitated, then typed in Officer Raymond Carter's name. The file opened with a series of performance reviews, most of them average. But as she scrolled further, a troubling pattern emerged. Complaints about unprofessional conduct, vague accusations of targeting minority drivers, and dismissals of those complaints due to insufficient evidence. Charlotte clenched her jaw. It was not just Carter. This was a symptom of a larger problem. She needed to address the system that allowed such behavior to persist. By mid-morning, Charlotte was at her office, a small but efficient space in the department's administrative wing. Her desk was clutter-free, save for a framed photo of her parents and a small plant Ellie Martinez, her new intern, had brought her as a welcome gift. Ellie was already at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop. A recent graduate with big dreams of reforming public policy, Ellie was eager and bright, though a bit reserved. "Ellie," Charlotte called, "can you pull the files on our recent community engagement programs? I want to review their impact before tomorrow's meeting." "Of course," Ellie replied, her voice soft but assured. As Ellie worked, Charlotte observed her. She noticed how Ellie paused every so often to help another colleague who was struggling with a technical issue. It was not part of her job, but Ellie's small acts of kindness seemed to make the office feel lighter. Later that afternoon, as Charlotte prepared to leave for a seminar on leadership and bias, she invited Ellie to join her. "I think this will be valuable for you," she said. Ellie hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "I'm sure," Charlotte said with a small smile. "You're part of this team, and your perspective matters." The seminar was held in a modest conference room downtown. Charlotte had attended many of these before, but this time she felt a stronger sense of purpose. The facilitator, a psychologist specializing in workplace dynamics, opened with a story about bias, how it often manifested not in overt actions, but in subtle decisions and assumptions. During the discussion, a young officer named Kyle Harper shared his experience. Kyle, who had been bullied for his stutter in his early years on the force, spoke candidly about how a sergeant's consistent encouragement had helped him find his footing. "I didn't even know I needed that support until someone gave it," Kyle admitted. "It changed the way I approach people. Now I try to do the same for others." His words lingered in Charlotte's mind as the seminar ended. It was not grand gestures or sweeping reforms that had helped Kyle, it was one person's unexpected kindness. On the drive home, Charlotte thought about how she could apply that lesson. When she reached her apartment complex, she found Mr. Henry on his porch again. He was watering his flowers, humming a tune from his youth. "You're out late," he remarked, glancing up as she approached. "Seminar," Charlotte replied. It was about implicit bias and leadership. Mr. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Did you learn anything new?" "Not new, but it reminded me of something important," she said. "Change starts with small, intentional actions." Mr. Henry smiled, his wrinkles deepening. "That's the way, Charlotte. Brick by brick, you build the foundation." As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Charlotte felt a spark of hope. The next day, she would propose a new initiative, pairing officers with young people in underprivileged neighborhoods. It was a small step, but one that could sow seeds of empathy and understanding. Her resolve grew as she settled into her nightly routine. Jazz played softly in the background, the city lights twinkled outside her window, and Charlotte began drafting her plan. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Charlotte's office as she adjusted her notes. Today was critical. She would propose her mentorship initiative to the department's senior staff, an idea that had taken shape over late-night brainstorming sessions and quiet reflection. Her plan was straightforward. Pair seasoned officers with youth from underserved neighborhoods to foster mutual understanding and trust. Charlotte understood the stakes. The department's culture often resisted change, and any initiative that required time outside standard duties would meet skepticism. But she also knew the importance of starting somewhere, no matter how small the step seemed. Ellie arrived with a stack of files, her usual determined expression tinged with curiosity. "I included the data you requested," she said. "It shows how community programs reduce negative interactions between police and civilians." Charlotte scanned the documents, impressed by Ellie's thoroughness. "Thank you, Ellie. This will help strengthen the proposal." Ellie lingered for a moment, then asked, "Are you nervous?" Charlotte gave a small laugh. "Always. But I've learned that nerves can mean you're about to do something important." By mid-morning, Charlotte stood before the senior staff in the department's conference room. The space felt as imposing as ever, with its long table, leather chairs, and the ever-watchful gaze of Chief Alan Monroe, seated at the head. The room was full, with officers and administrators exchanging skeptical glances as Charlotte outlined her idea. She spoke clearly, weaving data and personal anecdotes into her argument. "This program isn't just about helping at-risk youth," she said, her voice firm. "It's about changing perceptions, both theirs and ours. It's about rebuilding trust where it has been eroded." For a moment, the room was silent. Then came the expected pushback. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, a veteran officer known for his resistance to change, leaned forward. "This sounds idealistic," he said, his tone clipped. "We're already stretched thin. Now you want us to play social worker?" Charlotte met his gaze. "I'm asking us to be part of the solution. If we don't invest in building relationships, the divide between law enforcement and the community will only grow." The chief raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that followed. "Let's put it to a vote," he said. To Charlotte's surprise, The majority voted in favor of piloting the program. Chief Monroe nodded. "You have 6 months, Davis. Make it count." The mentorship program launched with cautious optimism. Ellie and Officer Kyle Harper were among the first volunteers, paired with a group of teenagers from a local community center. One of those teens was Jamal Rivers, a 15-year-old known for his sharp wit and short temper. Jamal arrived at the first meeting with his arms crossed, his expression defiant. "Why do we need cops in our business?" he muttered under his breath. Kyle, who had once been on the receiving end of similar skepticism, approached with patience. "We're here to listen," he said simply. The ice began to thaw when Ellie shared her story. "When I was your age," she told the group, "I thought no one cared about what I had to say. But someone showed me kindness when I least expected it, and it changed everything." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Ellie smiled softly. "A teacher noticed I loved drawing and encouraged me to enter a contest. I didn't win, but her belief in me made me want to try harder. Sometimes it just takes one person to believe in you." Jamal didn't respond, but later that day, he asked Ellie if she could help him find art classes in the city. Sure. Meanwhile, Charlotte received mixed reactions from her colleagues. Some praised her for taking initiative, while others whispered about the program being a waste of resources. The pressure weighed on her, but moments like the one between Ellie and Jamal reminded her why she had started this journey. One evening, Charlotte visited Mr. Henry to share updates. She found him tending to his flowers, humming softly. "How's the program going?" he asked, setting down his watering can. "Better than I expected," Charlotte admitted, "but there's still resistance." Mr. Henry nodded knowingly. "Change is like gardening, Charlotte. You plant seeds, water them, and wait. Sometimes the soil isn't ready, but you keep trying. The ones that grow will surprise you." His words stayed with her as she returned to her apartment. That night, she drafted a memo to expand the program's scope, incorporating community events to bring officers and residents together. One of those events was a cleanup day organized by the teens in Jamal's group. What started as a small project to clear debris from a neighborhood park turned into a gathering of officers, residents, and local leaders. Charlotte watched from the sidelines as Kyle and Jamal worked side by side, their laughter echoing through the park. Ellie was helping a group of younger kids plant flowers in the newly cleared soil. Even Lieutenant Reynolds, who had been vocal about his doubts, showed up to lend a hand. The sight filled Charlotte with quiet pride. The program was still in its infancy, but it was already creating moments of connection. As the sun set over the park, Charlotte noticed Chief Monroe approaching. "You've made progress," he said, his tone less formal than usual. "Thank you," Charlotte replied, "but there's still a long way to go." The chief nodded. "You've got my support. Keep going." Charlotte felt a wave of relief. With the chief's backing, she could continue building the program and, perhaps, the trust that had been missing for so long. The evening air was cool as Charlotte sat on her balcony, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands. Below her, the quiet hum of the neighborhood created a soothing backdrop. The cleanup day at the park had been a small but encouraging success, yet Charlotte's mind was already racing toward the next steps. The doubts and resistance from some colleagues still lingered in her thoughts, like static she could not quite tune out. On her coffee table lay Mr. Henry's journal. She had read parts of it over the past few weeks, but tonight she felt drawn to it with renewed purpose. Opening it, she flipped to a passage marked with a pressed flower, its edges yellowed with age. The entry was dated June 1963 and recounted a moment in Mr. Henry's life as a young postal worker. He had been walking his route in a predominantly white neighborhood when a group of boys began to taunt him, throwing slurs and small stones. Henry had kept his head down, determined to finish his route, when an elderly white woman stepped onto her porch and shouted at the boys to stop. She called me over, handed me a glass of lemonade, and said, They'll learn better someday. Until then, you keep your head high. I never forgot her kindness, the entry concluded. Charlotte closed the journal, her fingers resting on its cover. The story stirred something in her, a reminder of how even the smallest acts of kindness could shift someone's path. She realized that the mentorship program, while promising, needed something more. It needed stories, connections, and personal stakes to bridge the gaps. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the station with fresh determination. She called Ellie and Kyle into her office to discuss expanding the program to include community story-sharing events. "Why stories?" Kyle asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Because they're personal," Charlotte replied. "Data is important, but stories make people feel. If we want to bridge divides, we need to create moments where people see each other's humanity." Ellie's eyes lit up. "I could reach out to the community center and see if anyone's willing to share their experiences." "Good idea," Charlotte said. "And Kyle, see if you can encourage some of the officers to participate. The more voices we have, the better." The first story-sharing event took place in the modest gymnasium of the local community center. Folding chairs were arranged in a wide circle and a microphone stood at the center. The room filled slowly with residents and officers, the atmosphere tinged with curiosity and skepticism. Charlotte opened the event with a brief speech. "We're here to listen," she said, "to learn from each other. This is a safe space to share, to connect, and to understand." The first speaker was an older woman, Mrs. Carter, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She recounted an incident from years ago when her son had been wrongly accused of theft. The officer who handled the case eventually realized the mistake and apologized a moment that had stuck with her. "It's not the bad moments I remember most," Mrs. Carter said. "It's the good ones, like that apology. It gave me hope." As more people shared their stories, the room began to shift. Skepticism gave way to reflection, and conversations sparked between unlikely participants. Kyle stood to share his own experience of overcoming bullying, and even Jamal, hesitant at first, described how his late grandfather had inspired his love of drawing. "It was the one thing he always encouraged me to do," Jamal said, his voice steady. "He said it was my way of showing the world who I am." When the microphone passed to Officer Raymond Carter, the same man who had pulled Charlotte over weeks earlier, the room went still. Carter hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "and I've been too proud to admit them. But hearing all of you tonight, I realize I need to do better. I want to do better." Charlotte watched the faces in the room soften. Carter's words, while imperfect, were a step toward accountability. For the first time, she felt that change was not just possible, but already underway. Later that night, Charlotte visited Mr. Henry to tell him about the event. He was sitting on his porch, as he often did, surrounded by the faint scent of blooming jasmine. "You were right," Charlotte said as she took a seat beside him. "Stories are powerful. They remind people of what connects us." Mr. Henry smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes it's not about big speeches or fancy programs. It's about showing people what they already know deep down, that we're all more alike than we are different." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. "This was the woman who gave me that lemonade," he said, handing it to Charlotte. "I kept it all these years because she reminded me that even in dark times, there's light." Charlotte studied the photograph, a quiet awe settling over her. She realized that Mr. Henry's wisdom, born from decades of life's trials and triumphs, was the anchor she needed as she continued her work. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the station early. She began drafting plans for a series of story-sharing events across the city, envisioning a network of connections that could ripple far beyond her department. She also made a note to meet with Chief Monroe to discuss integrating these events into the department's long-term strategy. As she worked, a knock at the door interrupted her. Ellie stepped in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," Ellie said, setting the cup on Charlotte's desk. "Thank you," Charlotte replied, her heart warming at the gesture. Ellie lingered for a moment. "The event last night, it was special. You're making a real difference." Charlotte nodded, her resolve strengthening. "We all are." Charlotte entered the station early, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The air was cool and still, the hum of computers barely audible as the administrative staff began their day. She had meetings lined up, but her mind lingered on the story-sharing event from the night before. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope that her efforts might be making a difference. However, the lingering skepticism within the department weighed heavily on her. She had seen the sideways glances and heard the whispers of discontent. Change was never easy, especially in an institution steeped in tradition, and the resistance had grown more vocal since her initiatives began. Charlotte settled into her office, organizing her notes for a briefing with Chief Monroe. As she reviewed the agenda, a sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds stepped in, his presence filling the room with an air of authority and tension. "Morning, Lieutenant," Charlotte said evenly, gesturing toward a chair. Reynolds ignored the offer, standing stiffly near the door. "I need a word," he said, his tone clipped. Charlotte clasped her hands together, bracing herself. "What's on your mind?" "This mentorship program of yours," he began, his voice laced with skepticism. "It's stirring up more division than unity. I've had officers coming to me, complaining about being forced into something that distracts from real policing." Charlotte felt a flicker of irritation, but kept her tone measured. "No one is being forced into anything. This program is voluntary." "Voluntary on paper," Reynolds shot back. "But we both know the pressure to participate. Some of us think this is doing more harm than good. The trust you're trying to build out there is eroding trust in here." Charlotte stood, meeting his gaze with calm authority. "If the trust in this department is so fragile that accountability and empathy threaten it, then perhaps it wasn't as strong as you thought." Reynolds bristled, his jaw tightening. "You're walking a fine line, Davis. The rank and file aren't happy." Charlotte didn't flinch. "I'm aware of the resistance, Lieutenant, but I won't let that deter me. These programs are about repairing relationships that should have never been broken. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's time they examine why." Reynolds stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning on his heel and leaving without another word. By midday, Charlotte found herself in Chief Monroe's office. He listened intently as she provided updates on the mentorship program and the story-sharing event. Despite his usual reserved demeanor, there was a flicker of approval in his eyes as she spoke. "You've made progress," Monroe said, leaning back in his chair. "But the resistance is growing louder. Some of the senior officers have submitted a petition claiming your initiatives are disruptive." Charlotte sighed inwardly, but nodded. "I expected this, Chief. Change always meets resistance. But the events we've held are working. Officers like Kyle Harper and community members like Jamal are forming real connections. That's worth the discomfort." Monroe studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "I'll stand by you, Davis, but you'll need to handle this carefully. Push too hard, and you risk alienating the department. Too softly, and the progress you've made will stall." Charlotte left his office with mixed emotions. Monroe's support was crucial, but his caution reminded her that her work was far from over. That evening, Charlotte attended a mentorship session at the community center. She arrived to find Kyle and Ellie chatting with a small group of teens, including Jamal. The boy had started bringing a sketch pad to every meeting, his once defensive posture now relaxed. "Hey, Ms. Davis," Jamal greeted her with a faint smile. "Good to see you, Jamal," Charlotte replied warmly. "What are you working on?" Jamal hesitated, then turned his sketch pad to reveal a drawing of the park cleanup event. The image captured the group planting flowers, with details so vivid it felt almost alive. "This is incredible," Charlotte said, her admiration genuine. "You have real talent." Jamal shrugged, though his expression betrayed a flicker of pride. "It's just something I do." "Something you do?" Kyle interjected, grinning. "Man, this is a masterpiece." Ellie leaned in, her voice encouraging. "You should consider entering an art contest. There are a few local ones coming up." Jamal looked uncertain, but Charlotte could see the idea taking root. His walls were coming down, brick by brick. As the session wrapped up, Jamal lingered behind while the others left. "Ms. Davis," he began, his tone quieter now. "Thanks for, doing this stuff. It's different, but it's cool." Charlotte smiled, a warmth spreading through her. "You're the reason we're doing it, Jamal. You and everyone else who deserves to be seen and heard." The next morning, Charlotte received an email that made her pause. It was from Officer Raymond Carter. After his vulnerable moment at the story-sharing event, she had been uncertain whether his words reflected genuine growth or a fleeting sense of obligation. The email was brief but sincere. "Ms. Davis," it read, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to reflect. I've been meeting with a counselor, and it's helping. I hope I can be part of the change you're working toward. Carter." Charlotte sat back in her chair, a faint smile on her lips. Carter's small step forward was proof that progress was possible, even in the most unlikely places. As she closed the email, Ellie appeared in the doorway, holding a report. "We've got some promising data on the program's impact," she said. "Attendance is up, and complaints against officers in the pilot group have decreased." Charlotte took the report, her mind already spinning with ideas for the next steps. "Good work, Ellie. Let's keep the momentum going." Later that day, Charlotte visited Mr. Henry. She found him on his porch, as usual, sipping iced tea. "Seems like things are moving along," he said as she sat down beside him. "They are," Charlotte replied. "Slowly, but surely." Mr. Henry chuckled. "That's the only way worth doing, Charlotte. The strong roots take time to grow." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charlotte felt a quiet determination settle over her. The resistance she faced within the department was daunting, but the connection she was building, one story, one person, one act of kindness at a time, gave her the strength to keep going. Charlotte sat in her office, the late afternoon sunlight slanting through the blinds. The week had been a whirlwind of activity mentorship sessions, meetings with community leaders, and hours spent addressing concerns from within the department. Yet, despite the momentum, she could feel the weight of resistance growing heavier. A memo had circulated that morning, signed by several senior officers, including Lieutenant Reynolds. It accused Charlotte's initiatives of distracting from core law enforcement responsibilities and undermining morale within the ranks. Reading it had felt like a punch to the gut, but Charlotte knew this battle would never be easy. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Chief Monroe's assistant, asking her to meet with him immediately. Charlotte closed her laptop, grabbed her notes, and headed for his office, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floors. When she entered, Monroe was standing by the window, his usual stern expression softened slightly by the golden light pouring in. He gestured for her to sit. "Charlotte," he began, his voice measured, "I assume you've seen the memo." "I have," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "It's disappointing, but not unexpected." Monroe nodded, his brow furrowed. "The petition has gained traction. Some of the senior officers are pushing for a full departmental vote to reconsider the mentorship program." Charlotte felt a flicker of irritation, but quickly suppressed it. "With respect, Chief, this program is already showing results. Complaints against officers in the pilot group have dropped, and community feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." Monroe sighed and leaned against his desk. "I'm not questioning the program's value, Charlotte, but the dissent within the department is creating tension I can't ignore. If we're not careful, this could spiral into something bigger." Charlotte met his gaze, her resolve firm. We can't let fear of backlash stop us. This is about more than one program. It's about proving that change is possible and necessary. Monroe studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll support you, but you'll need to address this directly. Speak to the officers at the next department meeting. Make them see why this matters. I will, Charlotte said, a quiet determination in her voice. The department meeting was scheduled for the following day. Charlotte spent the evening drafting her remarks, carefully balancing data with personal anecdotes. As she worked, she received a notification on her phone, a new email from Raymond Carter. The subject line read, "Thank you." Charlotte opened it, her curiosity piqued. Carter's message was brief, but heartfelt. He wrote about how the story-sharing event had been a turning point for him, prompting him to seek counseling and reevaluate his approach to policing. I know I've made mistakes, he admitted, but I want to do better. Your work is making a difference, even if some people can't see it yet. Charlotte read the email twice, a wave of unexpected relief washing over her. Carter's words were a reminder that change, no matter how incremental, was still progress. The next morning, Charlotte entered the conference room where the department meeting was being held. The atmosphere was tense, with officers clustered in small groups, their conversations hushed. Lieutenant Reynolds stood near the back, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. Charlotte took her place at the front of the room, her notes in hand. As the chatter died down, she looked out at the faces before her, some skeptical, some supportive, and others simply curious. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "I know there's been a lot of discussion about the mentorship program and the changes we've implemented. I'm here to address your concerns and to share why this work is so important." She spoke about the early successes of the program, citing data on reduced complaints and increased community engagement. Then she shifted to personal stories of Kyle Harper, who had overcome his struggles with bullying, and Jamal Rivers, whose passion for art was blossoming thanks to the program's support. "These aren't just numbers or anecdotes," Charlotte said, her gaze sweeping the room. "They're proof that small actions can lead to meaningful change. And isn't that why we became officers? To make a difference?" The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Then, to Charlotte's surprise, Carter stood up. "I wasn't sure about this program at first," he admitted, his voice steady but emotional. "But it's made me think about my own actions and how they affect the people we serve. I've started counseling, and I'm working on being better. If I can do that, we all can." His statement hung in the air, a powerful testament to the program's impact. Slowly, a few officers nodded, their expressions softening. Lieutenant Reynolds remained silent, but his usual scowl had been replaced by a more contemplative look. After the meeting, Charlotte returned to her office, feeling a cautious sense of hope. The resistance hadn't vanished, but the tide was beginning to turn. As she settled into her chair, Ellie appeared in the doorway, holding a piece of paper. "You'll want to see this," she said, handing it over. It was a handwritten letter from Jamal's grandmother, thanking Charlotte for her work. "Jamal has been more confident and engaged since joining the program," it read. "You've given him something to believe in, and for that, I'm forever grateful." Charlotte felt her throat tighten as she read the words. The letter was a reminder of why she had started this journey and why she couldn't give up. That evening, she visited Mr. Henry, finding him on his porch as usual. He greeted her with a warm smile, motioning for her to sit. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world," he said, his tone light but perceptive. "Sometimes it feels that way," Charlotte admitted. "But today was a good day." She told him about the meeting, Carter's speech, and the letter from Jamal's grandmother. Mr. Henry listened, nodding thoughtfully. "Change is like tending a garden," he said after a moment. "It takes time, patience, and care. But when the first flowers bloom, it makes all the hard work worth it." Charlotte smiled, the tension in her chest easing. She wasn't just tending a garden. She was planting seeds of hope that could grow into something far greater. The department was buzzing with activity the next morning. Officers bustled through the halls, their voices rising and falling like waves in the ocean of tension that had become increasingly common. Charlotte moved through the station with her usual poise, a quiet but commanding presence. The meeting the day before had been a step forward, but she knew the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. As she settled into her office, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. It was from Chief Monroe, asking her to come to his office immediately. Charlotte's stomach tightened. In her experience, urgency often signaled trouble. When she entered Monroe's office, he was pacing by his desk, a grim expression on his face. On his desk lay a thick folder marked "Confidential." He motioned for her to close the door. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Charlotte sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "What's happened?" Monroe sighed and pushed the folder toward her. "A citizen has come forward with a serious complaint against one of our officers. It's Raymond Carter." Charlotte opened the folder and scanned the report. A woman had accused Carter of using excessive force during a traffic stop a month prior. The details were troubling, and while the incident predated Carter's participation in the mentorship program, it painted a damning picture of his past behavior. Charlotte's heart sank. Carter had shown genuine growth over the past weeks, even becoming a vocal supporter of her initiatives. But this report was a stark reminder of the challenges they faced, not just changing behaviors, but addressing the harm already done. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her tone steady but tinged with concern. Monroe leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Handle it. This is your domain, Charlotte. But be prepared, this will ripple through the department and the community. How you handle this could define the program's future." Charlotte spent the rest of the day reviewing the complaint and gathering evidence. She interviewed the woman who had filed the report, a young mother named Angela, who described the encounter in vivid detail. Her voice trembled as she recounted how Carter had pulled her over, shouted at her without cause, and forced her to exit the vehicle in front of her young son. "I didn't feel like a person," Angela said, her eyes welling with tears. "I felt like I didn't matter." Charlotte's chest tightened. She thanked Angela for her courage and promised a thorough investigation. As she left the interview, she couldn't shake the image of Angela's trembling hands or the fear in her voice. The following day, Charlotte convened an internal hearing to address the complaint. The room was tense, the air heavy with unspoken judgments. Carter sat across from her, his expression somber but resolute. The investigative team presented the evidence, outlining the details of Angela's complaint. When it was Carter's turn to speak, he didn't deny the accusations. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I was going through a tough time, and I let it affect how I treated people. That's no excuse, but it's the truth." Charlotte studied him, her emotions conflicted. Carter's willingness to take accountability was a step forward, but it didn't erase the harm he had caused. The room was silent as everyone awaited her response. "Officer Carter," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Acknowledging your mistakes is important, but it's only the first step. Your actions that day caused real harm, and it's our responsibility to ensure that harm is addressed." Carter nodded, his gaze steady. "I want to make it right. Tell me what I need to do." Charlotte took a deep breath. "You'll undergo additional training, including sessions on de-escalation and implicit bias. You'll also participate in a restorative justice meeting with Angela, if she agrees. And until we're confident in your progress, your duties will be restricted." The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some officers whispered among themselves, questioning the fairness of the punishment, while others nodded in approval. Carter simply bowed his head, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Later that evening, Charlotte met with Angela again, to discuss the restorative justice process. Angela was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed, saying, "If it can help him understand what he did, I'm willing to try." The meeting took place a week later in a neutral space, with a trained mediator present. Angela shared her experience, her voice steady but emotional. Carter listened intently, his expression etched with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't think about how my actions affected you or your son. I can't undo what I did, but I'll do everything I can to make sure it never happens again." Angela's eyes softened, though her pain was still evident. "I hope you mean that," she said, "because people like me, we need officers we can trust." The process, while difficult, marked a turning point for Carter. He became more vocal in his support for the program, using his experience as a cautionary tale for other officers. Slowly, his presence began to shift perceptions within the department. One afternoon, as Charlotte was leaving the station, she saw Carter speaking with a group of new recruits. He was telling them about the importance of treating every person with respect, no matter the circumstances. Charlotte watched from a distance, a quiet sense of hope settling over her. Change was slow and often painful, but it was happening one person, one step at a time. That evening, she visited Mr. Henry, who was sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea. She told him about the hearing, the restorative justice meeting, and the progress Carter was making. "You're doing good work, Charlotte," Mr. Henry said, his voice warm. "But remember, the road to change is never straight. It's full of twists and turns. What matters is that you keep moving forward." Charlotte nodded, the weight of his words settling into her bones. She wasn't just leading a program, she was building a foundation for something bigger, something lasting. The late summer air was warm as Charlotte drove to the community center. The streets of Dallas seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the city softened in the evening glow. She had spent the better part of the day drafting reports and finalizing details for the mentorship program's expansion. It had been weeks since the restorative justice meeting between Carter and Angela, and the progress they had made gave her hope. But hope, Charlotte knew, was a fragile thing. Resistance within the department was still simmering just below the surface, and she sensed another challenge waiting on the horizon. When she arrived at the community center, she was greeted by the sound of laughter and chatter. A group of teens, including Jamal, were gathered near a table filled with art supplies. Nearby, Kyle and Ellie were talking with parents, their easy rapport a testament to the connections the program had fostered. Jamal looked up and waved her over. His once guarded demeanor had softened in recent weeks, and he now greeted her with a confidence that made Charlotte's heart swell with pride. "Ms. Davis," he called, "come check this out." Charlotte joined him at the table, where he was working on a mural sketch. The design depicted a vibrant cityscape, with people of all backgrounds coming together in harmony. "This is amazing, Jamal," Charlotte said, her admiration genuine. "What's the inspiration?" Jamal shrugged, though a small smile tugged at his lips. "Just what I want to see around here, you know? People working together instead of fighting all the time." Charlotte nodded, her gaze lingering on the sketch. "You're capturing something really important. This could be more than just a drawing. It could be a symbol for the change we're building." Jamal grinned, his usual cool demeanor momentarily breaking. "Maybe if we get the wall for it." Later, as the event wound down, Charlotte found herself talking with Kyle. The young officer had become one of the program's most vocal advocates, and his work with Jamal and the other teens had proven transformative. "You're doing great things here, Kyle," Charlotte said. "The department could use more people like you." Kyle smiled sheepishly. "Honestly, I think this program's done more for me than for them. It's made me realize how much we miss when we only see people as problems to solve instead of as individuals with stories." Charlotte's chest tightened at his words. It was the kind of realization she had hoped the program would inspire, but hearing it said aloud reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. The following week, Charlotte received unexpected news. The city council had approved funding for a mural project in the community, and the mentorship program had been invited to take part. Jamal's sketch was chosen as the centerpiece, and the teens, with guidance from local artists, would paint the mural on the side of the community center. When she shared the news with Jamal, his face lit up with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Completely serious," Charlotte replied with a warm smile. "Your vision is going to be on full display for everyone to see." Jamal shook his head, laughing softly. "Man, I never thought something like this would happen." "Thanks, Ms. Davis. For real." The mural project became a symbol of unity, drawing officers, community members, and local leaders together in a way that few initiatives had before. On the first day of painting, Charlotte arrived to find the lot buzzing with activity. Kyle and Carter were helping set up scaffolding, while Ellie organized supplies. Parents and children mingled with officers, laughter and conversation filling the air. As Charlotte watched Jamal lead a group of younger kids in painting the base layer, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This was what change looked like: messy, imperfect, but undeniably real. Midway through the day, Carter approached Charlotte. His expression was tentative but earnest. "Ms. Davis," he began, "I just wanted to thank you for everything. This program, it's changed how I sees things, how I see people." Charlotte regarded him thoughtfully. "It's not just the program, Officer Carter. It's you. You chose to reflect, to grow, and to do better. That's not an easy thing to do." Carter nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I still have a lot to work on, but I'm committed to getting it right." "I believe you," Charlotte said, her voice steady. "And so do a lot of other people." By the end of the week, the mural was complete. The vibrant colors and intricate details made the wall seem alive, and Jamal's vision of unity shone brightly in every stroke. The unveiling ceremony drew a large crowd, with city officials, officers, and residents coming together to celebrate. As Charlotte stood before the mural, she felt a wave of emotion. The journey had been filled with challenges, but moments like this reminded her why she had kept going. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the crowd with quiet conviction. "This mural isn't just art, it's a promise that we can build bridges instead of walls, that we can choose connection over division. And that change is possible, one step at a time." The crowd erupted into applause, and Charlotte felt a swell of hope. That evening, she visited Mr. Henry. She found him on his porch, as usual, gazing at the stars. "You've been busy," he said, smiling as she joined him. "Very," Charlotte replied, sinking into the chair beside him. "But it's worth it." Mr. Henry nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Change always is, Charlotte, and you're proving it can happen even in the toughest places." As they sat in comfortable silence, Charlotte allowed herself a rare moment of rest. The road ahead was still long, but the mural was a beacon, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples of transformation. The email arrived on a crisp Monday morning, nestled between meeting reminders and routine updates. As Charlotte opened it, her eyes scanned the subject line: "Invitation to National Policing Symposium." The sender was a well-known organization dedicated to law enforcement reform, and the invitation requested that Charlotte present the mentorship program as a model for bridging community-police relations. For a moment, Charlotte stared at the screen, her coffee cooling in her hand. The recognition was validating, a clear sign that her work was making waves beyond Dallas. But with it came a sense of pressure. This wasn't just about showcasing the program's success. It was about representing the broader fight for equity and accountability. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ellie stepped in, her usual composed demeanor tinged with excitement. "I just saw the email," Ellie said. "This is huge, Charlotte. You deserve this." Charlotte smiled, though it felt tentative. Thank you, Ellie. It's a great opportunity, but it's also a lot of responsibility. Ellie sat across from her, tilting her head thoughtfully. You've already done the hard part building something that works. Now you just have to share it. And you're good at that. Charlotte nodded, her mind already racing with ideas for her presentation. I'll need to prepare. Can you help me gather the data and success stories we've compiled? Of course, Ellie said. I'll get started right away. Over the next week, Charlotte immersed herself in preparation. She reviewed reports, selected impactful anecdotes, and crafted a narrative that balanced hard facts with human stories. But as the presentation took shape, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Late one evening, Charlotte sat in her apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window. On the table before her was Mr. Henry's journal, its worn pages filled with tales of resilience and kindness. She flipped to a passage she had read many times before, a story about a young man who had faced relentless prejudice but found solace in the unexpected kindness of a neighbor. You keep your head high, the neighbor had said. The world's not always fair, but that doesn't mean you can't make it better. The words resonated deeply. They reminded Charlotte of why she had started this work, not just to address injustice, but to create a foundation for hope and connection. On the day of the symposium, Charlotte stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to her blouse. The room beyond the curtain was filled with law enforcement leaders, policymakers, and community advocates from across the country. It was a daunting audience, but Charlotte drew strength from the knowledge that she wasn't standing there alone. She carried with her the stories of people like Jamal, Kyle, and Carter's stories that proved change was possible. When her name was announced, Charlotte stepped onto the stage to a round of polite applause. The bright lights made it difficult to see the faces in the crowd, but she focused on her prepared remarks, her voice steady and clear. I'm here to talk about bridges, she began. Not the kind made of steel and concrete, but the kind built with trust, understanding, and shared purpose. She spoke about the mentorship program, weaving together data and personal anecdotes. She shared Jamal's journey from a skeptical teenager to an aspiring artist whose mural now stood as a symbol of unity. She recounted Kyle's transformation, from an officer struggling with self-doubt to a mentor who had found new purpose in his work. And she didn't shy away from Carter's story, using it to illustrate the power of accountability and redemption. This program isn't perfect, Charlotte admitted, her voice softening. Change is never easy, and progress is often messy. But what I've learned is that small acts of kindness, when multiplied, can create ripples that reach far beyond what we can see. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, before erupting into applause. Charlotte exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her as she stepped away from the podium. After the presentation, several attendees approached her with questions and words of encouragement. Among them was a tall man with salt and pepper hair who introduced himself as Chief Bennett from Chicago. Ms. Davis, he said, his tone warm, your presentation was powerful. We've been struggling with similar challenges in our department, and I think your program could be a model for us. Charlotte felt a swell of pride. Thank you, Chief. I'd be happy to share resources and insights to help you get started. As they talked, she realized that this moment wasn't just about recognition, it was about spreading the seeds of change to places far beyond Dallas. When Charlotte returned home, she stopped by Mr. Henry's porch. He was sitting in his usual spot, a book in his lap and a glass of iced tea by his side. You're back, he said, smiling as she approached. How did it go? Charlotte sat down, a contented sigh escaping her. Better than I expected. They listened, Mr. Henry. They really listened. That's because you spoke from the heart, he said. People can feel that, even when they don't want to admit it. Charlotte glanced up at the stars, her thoughts quiet but hopeful. I think we're starting something bigger than I ever imagined. Mr. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. Change starts small, Charlotte, but when it catches on, it's unstoppable. The Dallas skyline shimmered in the afternoon sun as Charlotte Davis drove through the city streets, her thoughts still lingering on the National Symposium. The week had been a whirlwind, an endless series of conversations, panels, and connections with leaders from across the country. She had returned to Dallas with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to expand the mentorship program and strengthen its foundations. But as she approached the station, a familiar tension crept into her chest. Change, no matter how celebrated on a national stage, still had to survive the realities of everyday resistance. The department remained divided. Some officers embraced the program's vision, while others clung to their skepticism. When Charlotte entered her office, she found Ellie waiting for her, a stack of papers in her hands. "Welcome back," Ellie said, her tone bright. "How was the symposium?" "Productive," Charlotte replied, setting her bag down. "But exhausting. I'm glad to be back." Ellie handed her the papers. "These are updates on the program. Attendance at mentorship sessions is steady, and the mural unveiling last week got great feedback." "But," Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "But what?" "There's been some grumbling," Ellie admitted. "A few senior officers are saying the program is taking too much focus away from traditional duties, and Lieutenant Reynolds mentioned scheduling a meeting to discuss priorities." Charlotte sighed. "Of course he did." Ellie hesitated, then added, "But there's also good news. Carter's been mentoring a new recruit, Officer Daniels, and it's going really well. Daniels even volunteered to lead the next community cleanup event." Charlotte's lips curved into a small smile. "That is good news. Thanks, Ellie. I'll take it from here." Later that afternoon, Charlotte met with Chief Monroe to discuss the program's next steps. She outlined her plans for expanding the mentorship initiative to other precincts and integrating it more deeply into the department's culture. Monroe listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "You've done impressive work, Charlotte," he said, "but you know this won't get easier. Expanding the program means inviting more scrutiny." "I know," Charlotte said, her voice steady, "but I also know we can't stop now. This is working. People are connecting in ways they haven't before. That's worth the risk." Monroe nodded slowly. "All right, I'll back the expansion, but you'll need to present the proposal at the next all-staff meeting. If you can win over more of the department, we'll have the momentum to move forward." The following week, Charlotte prepared tirelessly for the meeting. She reviewed data, compiled testimonials, and rehearsed her remarks. But as the day approached, an unexpected challenge arose. One evening, Charlotte received a call from Jamal's grandmother. Her voice was strained as she explained that Jamal had been in a fight at school. He was suspended for a week, and she worried the incident would undo all the progress he had made. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "He was doing so well, but now—" Charlotte felt a pang of worry, but quickly reassured her. "I'll talk to him," she said. "We'll figure this out." The next day, Charlotte visited Jamal at his grandmother's house. He was sitting on the porch steps, his arms crossed, and his expression guarded. "Mrs. Davis," he said, his tone defensive. "You here to lecture me?" "No," Charlotte replied, sitting down beside him. "I'm here to listen. Want to tell me what happened?" Jamal hesitated, then shrugged. "Some kid was talking trash about the mural, said it was pointless, that nothing's gonna change around here. I got mad. I didn't mean to hit him, but I lost it." Charlotte studied him for a moment. "That sounds frustrating, but you know as well as I do that punching someone won't solve anything." Jamal sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know. It feels like no matter what I do, someone's always got something to say. Like, what's the point of even trying?" Charlotte placed a hand on his shoulder. "The point, Jamal, is that change takes time, and not everyone will see it right away. But you've already made a difference. Look at that mural." Look at the younger kids who look up to you. That's not nothing. Jamal glanced at her, his expression softening. I guess. It's more than a guess, Charlotte said firmly. You're part of something bigger than this one moment, and you don't have to do it alone. By the end of their conversation, Jamal agreed to apologize to the other student and channel his frustration into his art. As Charlotte left, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work she was doing wasn't just about systems or policies. It was about people, about moments like this. At the all-staff meeting later that week, Charlotte stood before the department, her proposal for the mentorship program's expansion laid out in detail. She spoke about its successes, the lives it had touched, and the bridges it had begun to build. But she also addressed the resistance directly. I know some of you have concerns, she said, her voice steady. Change is hard. It asks us to step out of our comfort zones and see things differently. But if we want to serve this community, truly serve it, we need to build trust. And trust starts with understanding. The room was quiet as her words settled. Even Lieutenant Reynolds, who had been her most vocal critic, seemed contemplative. When the floor opened for questions, Carter stood up. I used to be one of those skeptics, he admitted, his voice steady. But this program changed how I see things and how I see myself. It's not about taking time away from our duties. It's about doing those duties better. His statement was met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Slowly, the tide was turning. That evening, Charlotte visited the mural. The vibrant colors glowed softly in the twilight, a testament to the power of collaboration and vision. As she stood there, she felt a quiet pride not just in what they had accomplished, but in the possibilities still ahead. The journey wasn't over, but it was moving forward. And for Charlotte, that was enough. In the months that followed, the mentorship program expanded to other precincts, becoming a cornerstone of the department's community engagement efforts. The mural became a symbol of hope, its message resonating with everyone who passed by. Jamal, inspired by his experiences, began mentoring younger kids, sharing his story, and encouraging them to find their voices. And Charlotte, though still facing challenges, continued to lead with resilience, kindness, and an unshakable belief in the power of connection. Because in the end, change wasn't just about big moments, it was about the small ones that built bridges and planted seeds of hope for the future. Charlotte's journey reminds us that change starts with small acts of courage, kindness, and resilience. Whether it's mentoring someone, listening to their story, or standing firm against resistance, each step we take toward understanding and connection has the power to transform lives. What about you? How would you work to build bridges in your community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories of perseverance, hope, and the power of human connection. Together we can spark vital conversations and build a brighter future for everyone.